The tribunal chamber was filled beyond capacity on the final day. Representatives from every member species crowded into observation galleries that had been designed for audiences a fraction of this size. The fate of the Vorn had become the most watched event in galactic history. Broadcast to billions of beings who had once thought of apex predators as nothing more than monsters to be destroyed. Now they were not so certain. And that uncertainty had brought them here to witness the moment when the Council would decide whether an entire species deserved to exist. Raxith was brought in chains that seemed almost decorative, given the number of armed guards surrounding him. His massive form somehow diminished by the vastness of the chamber and the weight of judgment that hung in the air. He walked with the dignity of a being who had accepted whatever fate awaited him, his glowing eyes scanning the crowd until they found the small figure seated in the human delegation section. Yuna waved at him, and something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly toward warmth. Ambassador Park presented the final arguments with a passion that surprised even his own staff, speaking not of law or precedent, but of something far more fundamental. The Galactic Council was founded on the principle that every species deserves the chance to contribute to the tapestry of civilized existence, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. Yet for centuries we have denied that chance to the Vorn, have hunted them and killed them and justified their extermination with claims that they were nothing but mindless predators. He gestured toward the evidence that had been presented over the previous days. The records of Vorn culture and the testimony of survivors who remembered a time before the war. We know now that this was a lie. Park continued. We know that the Vorn were transformed by our violence, not born to it. And we know that they retain the capacity for change, even after generations of being treated as nothing more than animals to be culled. He pointed toward Raxith, who sat motionless in his chains with the patience of a being who had nothing left to lose. This Vorn had every reason to hate humanity, every justification for violence against a universe that had stripped him of everything he loved. Yet when he heard that a human child was dying in the cold, he chose to save her. Park's voice dropped to something quieter, more intimate. Yet somehow it filled the chamber even more completely than his earlier passion. He chose gentleness when he could have chosen violence, chose protection when he could have chosen escape, chose hope when he had every reason for despair. He looked directly at the council members, meeting their eyes one by one. If that is not proof of a species worth saving, then I do not know what proof could ever be enough. The council prosecutor made his final arguments with cold precision, listing the deaths attributed to Vorn across centuries of conflict, describing the threat that apex predators pose to civilized society, arguing that one act of mercy could not erase generations of bloodshed. He was technically correct in every point he made, and the weight of history supported his position with overwhelming force. Yet something had shifted in the chamber, some balance of feeling that could not be measured by logic or precedent. And everyone present could sense that the outcome was no longer certain. The vote was called, and the council members entered their decisions into the system that would tabulate the result. Billions across the galaxy held their breath as the numbers were counted and recounted and verified by multiple independent systems. The result was a tie. Gasps echoed through the chamber as the unprecedented outcome was announced. Representatives turning to each other with expressions of shock and confusion. In all the history of the Galactic Council, no vote had ever ended in perfect balance, with exactly half supporting and half opposing. The ancient protocols were clear about what must happen next. The deciding vote fell to the eldest member of the council, a being called Dexnor, who had lived for over 1,000 cycles and had personally authorized the original Vorn extermination. When the war first began, he rose slowly from his seat, his age evident in every movement, yet his authority undiminished by the weight of years. The chamber fell silent as he approached the central platform where Raxeth sat in chains. Stopping close enough that he could have touched the Vorn if he chose. "I have hated your kind for longer than most species in this chamber have existed," Dexnor said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "I watched your people tear through my homeworld and kill beings I loved, and I swore that I would see every last Vorn dead before I joined the ancestors." He paused, and something in his ancient eyes shifted from hardness to something more complicated. "I believed I was protecting the galaxy from monsters," he continued. "I believed that extermination was mercy. That ending your species was the kindest thing we could do for a universe that feared your very existence." He turned to look at Yuna, who sat straight and still in her seat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Then I watched a child reach for a beast and call it friend, and I began to wonder if perhaps I had been wrong about everything." Dexnor faced Raxeth once more, and the two ancient enemies regarded each other across a divide of history and blood. "If I spare you," the elder asked, "if I grant your species the chance to rebuild under human protection, what will you do with that gift?" Raxeth was silent for a long moment, his glowing eyes fixed on the being who held the fate of his entire species in aged hands. When he spoke, his voice was the same deep rumble that had once terrified armies, but now it carried something else beneath the power. "I will protect," he said. "It is what I was meant to do. What my people were meant to do before you taught us to be killers instead of guardians." He looked at Yuna, and his voice softened in a way that no Vorn had spoken for generations. "A small human showed me that I could be more than what the universe had made me," he said. "I would spend whatever life remains to me proving that her faith was not misplaced." Dexnor nodded slowly, as if Raxeth's answer had confirmed something he had already decided. "I vote to spare the Vorn," he said. And the chamber erupted into chaos that took nearly an hour to quiet. The remaining Vorn were granted a protected homeworld in human space, a planet where they could rebuild their culture and remember the songs they had forgotten. Raxeth's sentence was commuted from execution to exile, and he was released into human custody to serve as a bridge between his species and the civilization that had chosen to believe in them. 6 months later, he stood in the garden of a human colony school, surrounded by children who should have been terrified of him, but instead treated him as the most fascinating playground equipment in the Thendes galaxy. They climbed on his arms and begged for rides on his shoulders, and asked him questions about space and stars and what it felt like to have 4 arms. He answered each question with patience that would have stunned anyone who had known him in the days when he was simply a monster. Yuna visited often, traveling from her new home with guardians who had learned to stop worrying about her friendship with an apex predator. On one such visit, she asked him a question that she had been holding on to for months. "What is the Vorn word for family?" she asked, sitting beside him in the garden while younger children played nearby. "Kethnor," Raxeth answered, the word rumbling from his chest like distant thunder. "It means those who protect and are protected, those who belong to each other regardless of blood." Yuna nodded, as if this confirmed something important, then looked up at him with the same steady gaze that had first reached through his defenses in the frozen wreckage of a crashed ship. "You are my Kethnor," she said, a voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Raxeth looked at the small human who had saved him from himself, who had seen something worth believing in when the entire galaxy had written him off as a monster, who had given him back the capacity for hope that he had thought was burned away forever. He made the humming sound that Vorn used to express love, the subsonic vibration that mothers had once used to soothe their young in dens that no longer existed, except in memory. "You are my Kethnor too," he said, "small one who taught a beast to be gentle." The garden was full of children and sunlight and the sound of laughter. And somewhere in the depths of space, the remaining Vorn were learning to sing again. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The right of species advocacy was an ancient law carved into the founding documents of the Galactic Council, created in an era when the civilized races still remembered what it meant to face extinction and wanted to ensure that no species would be erased without someone speaking in their defense. It had been invoked only 3 times in recorded history, and all 3 attempts had failed. The species in question had been wiped from existence, despite the efforts of their advocates. Their names now remembered only in legal textbooks as examples of how the right could not override the will of the Council. Ambassador Park Ji-hoon knew this history better than most, for he had studied every case file and legal precedent during the long journey to Kethvora. He also knew that humanity had almost no chance of winning this fight. The Vorn were not merely unpopular. They were actively feared and hated by nearly every species in the galaxy. Centuries of conflict had left deep wounds that propaganda had transformed into permanent scars. And even those who might have sympathy for a dying species recoiled at the thought of allowing apex predators to survive. Yet Park had looked into the eyes of a child who believed in monsters, and he had seen something there that gave him hope despite all evidence to the contrary. The stakes of the right were absolute and terrifying in their simplicity. If humanity succeeded in their advocacy, the Vorn would be granted protected status and allowed to rebuild their civilization under careful supervision. If humanity failed, the remaining Vorn would be hunted to extinction with full legal sanction, and the species that had once numbered in the billions would finally cease to exist entirely. Raxith would die either way, his crimes too severe to be pardoned. But the choice before the Council was whether his death would be the end of a monster or the final chapter of a genocide. Park visited Raxith in his cell the night before the tribunal, passing through security checkpoints that seemed designed more to intimidate than to actually prevent access. The guards watched him with expressions that mixed confusion and respect, for word had spread that this small human intended to defend the indefensible. Raxith sat in his cell with the stillness of a creature that had long ago learned patience, his massive form motionless except for the slow rhythm of his breathing. The drawing Yuna had made was carefully tucked into a gap in his armor plating, protected from damage in the only way he could manage with his clawed hands. "Why are you doing this?" he asked when Park stood before his cell. "Your species gains nothing from defending mine, and you risk much by opposing the Council." Park considered the question carefully before answering. "Yuna asked me to," he said simply. "And when a child believes in something strongly enough to cross the galaxy and face down politicians 10 times her age, I find it difficult to tell her she is wrong. Raxith made a sound that might have been laughter in another species. "She is remarkable. That small one," he said. "I have killed more beings than I can count, have fought in wars that burned worlds to ash. Yet I find myself undone by a child who looks at me and sees something other than a monster." He paused, his bioluminescent eyes dimming slightly in what Park had learned to recognize as the Vorn equivalent of sadness. "Why do you think she does not fear me?" Raxith asked. "Every other species sees what I am and recoils. Yet she reached for me when she should have screamed." Park thought about this, about the nature of humans and the strange ways they connected with other beings. "Humans see potential," he said finally. "We look at a thing and we do not just see what it is. We see what it could become. And sometimes the vision is strong enough to change reality itself." He stepped closer to the transparent barrier, close enough that a single swipe of Raxith's claws could have torn him apart, if not for the wall between them. "Yuna saw you, and she did not see an apex predator or a convicted killer or a monster," Park said. She saw someone who came for her when no one else would. Someone who carried her through a storm and kept her warm when the universe was trying to kill her. He met Raxith's glowing eyes without flinching. She saw someone worth believing in. And I think perhaps she was right. The human delegation spent the days before the tribunal digging through records that the council had tried to bury, searching for evidence that the Vorn had once been more than the killing machines they were portrayed. As what they found changed everything, Park thought. He knew about galactic history. The Vorn had not always been predators. Before the first contact with other species, they had been a civilization of artists and philosophers. Their culture built around complex social bonds and elaborate rituals of protection and care. They had sung songs in frequencies too low for most species to hear, had raised their young in communal dens where the entire community shared responsibility for each new life, had developed a form of art that combined scent and sound and touch into experiences that could not be translated into any other medium. Then the Galactic Council had arrived and declared them too dangerous to exist. The war that followed had transformed the Vorn from a peaceful species into exactly what the Council claimed they had always been. Generations of being hunted had bred out gentleness and bred in violence, until the songs were forgotten and the dens were empty, and all that remained were scattered survivors who knew nothing but how to fight and die. The Council had created the monsters they feared, and then used those monsters as justification for continuing the extermination. Park brought this evidence to the tribunal, presenting records that have been classified for centuries and testimony from historians who had risked their careers to preserve the truth. The council members listened with expressions that ranged from skepticism to outright hostility, but they could not deny the authenticity of the documents placed before them. A Vorn elder appeared via holographic projection, one of the last survivors old enough to remember what her species had once been. Her name was Kethzora, and she had been a keeper of songs before the war had taken everything she loved. "We did not begin as killers," she said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of grief. "We became what you made us, learned to be the monsters you named us, because that was the only way to survive." She looked directly at the council members who had authorized generations of death. "This one," she said, gesturing toward where Raxith sat in chains. "He has shown that we can learn to be something else again, that the songs are not entirely lost, that the dens might yet be rebuilt." Her voice cracked with emotion that she did not try to hide. If a human child can teach a Vorn to be gentle, imagine what we might become if you gave us the chance to remember who we were. Yuna visited Raxith one last time before the final day of the tribunal, slipping through security with the help of guards who had been quietly won over by her determination. She brought another drawing, this one more detailed than the first, showing a large figure surrounded by smaller figures in what looked like a garden. "This is you in the future," she explained, holding up the image so he could see. "When they let you out and you come to live with humans who will not be afraid of you." Raxith took the drawing with hands that could crush starships, handling the small paper as if it were the most precious thing in the universe. "What if they do not let me out?" he asked. "What if tomorrow they decide that I must die?" Yuna shook her head with the certainty that only children possess. "You will not die," she said, "because I believe in you, and when I believe in something very hard, it always comes true." She pressed her hand against the barrier, and Raxith placed his massive claw against the same spot on the other side. "My mother used to say that everyone deserves someone who believes in them," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Maybe no one believed in you before, but I believe in you now." Raxith made the humming sound that Vorn used to soothe their young, and Yuna smiled as if this answered every question she had ever had. "That is a good sound," she said. "You should make that sound more often." Tomorrow the council would decide the fate of his entire species, would choose between extinction and the slim hope of redemption. But in this moment, Raxith felt something he had not experienced since his den was burned and his family was killed, and the universe had become nothing but darkness. He felt hope. The footage spread across the galactic network like fire through dry grass, and within hours every inhabited world had seen the impossible image of a Vorn kneeling in the snow, with a human child's hand resting upon his claw. Commentators, who had spent careers warning about the danger of apex predators, found themselves speechless before the sight of the galaxy's most feared killer placing himself between a child and weapons-fire politicians who had built platforms on the necessity of Vorn extinction. Suddenly discovered urgent appointments that prevented them from commenting on the situation. The universe had expected a monster, and instead it had witnessed something that defied every assumption the civilized races had made about what the Vorn truly were. In the prison of Kethvora, Raxus sat in his cell once more, his chains replaced with even heavier restraints that the warden had ordered brought from the maximum security vault. The damaged wall had been sealed with emergency plating, and armed guards now stood watch in shifts of 6 rather than the usual 2. None of these precautions mattered to Raxith, who had returned to his cage willingly and waited now with the same patience he had shown before. The only difference was the small drawing that had been slipped through the food hatch by a guard who refused to meet his eyes. Yuna had made it during her recovery in the medical bay. A crude image rendered in colored wax that showed a large figure holding a small one surrounded by white that could only be snow. She had written her name at the bottom in shaky letters, and beneath it a single word that Raxith did not understand: friend. He held the paper in claws that could crush bone to powder, and he studied it with an intensity that he had once reserved only for tracking prey. The Galactic Council was furious, though their anger was carefully hidden behind diplomatic language and formal proceedings. The Vorn extermination had been justified for centuries by the claim that these creatures were mindless killing machines, biological weapons created by a careless universe, and too dangerous to coexist with civilized species. Raxith's actions threatened that narrative in ways that made powerful beings very uncomfortable. If a Vorn could choose to save rather than kill, could show gentleness rather than violence, could form bonds rather than simply destroy, then what did that say about the genocide that had reduced their species to scattered remnants? The answer was something the Council preferred not to examine too closely. Within 3 days of the rescue, Raxith's execution was moved forward from its scheduled date to the end of the current week. The official explanation cited security concerns and the need to maintain order in the prison. But everyone who watched the announcement knew the real reason the Council wanted the Vorn dead before anyone could ask too many questions about what he had done and why. The human delegation arrived on the 4th day, their ship cutting through the storms of Kethvora with a determination that impressed even the cynical prison staff. Humanity was still new to galactic civilization, a species that had barely mastered interstellar travel and held almost no political power among the established races. Most council members viewed humans as curiosities at best and nuisances at worst, tolerated because they showed some promise, but not yet worthy of serious consideration. Ambassador Pa Ji-hoon did not seem to care about any of this as he strode through the prison corridors with a confidence that made guards twice his size step aside. He had requested an audience with the council to discuss the matter of Raxith's execution, and when that request was denied, he had simply boarded a ship and come to Kethvora in person. His staff had advised against the trip, warning that the council would view it as an insult. But Park had simply smiled and said that sometimes the best way to handle people who refused to listen was to show up and speak anyway. The warden tried to prevent him from seeing the prisoner, citing safety protocols and the danger of allowing anyone near a Category Omega predator. But Park had brought something the warden could not ignore. He had brought Yuna. The child had refused to leave without saying goodbye to her friend. And her new guardians had eventually yielded to her determination, rather than watch her cry herself to exhaustion every night. The medical staff had cleared her for travel, though they expressed concerns about the psychological impact of visiting the creature that had saved her. Those concerns proved unfounded. The moment Yuna saw Raxith through the transparent wall of his cell, she did not flinch or pull away, did not show any of the trauma responses the doctors had warned about, but instead pressed her small hands against the barrier and smiled with a joy that transformed her entire face. "I made you a picture," she said, her voice carrying through the communication system built into the cell wall. "Did you get it?" Raxith rose from where he had been sitting and approached the barrier slowly, aware of the guards tensing around him but unable to care about their fear. He held up the drawing so she could see it, and her smile grew even brighter. "You kept it," she said. "I was worried they would take it away." "They tried," Raxith admitted, his voice the same deep rumble that had once terrified entire planets. "I would not let them." Ambassador Park watched this exchange with careful attention, his diplomat's eyes noting every detail of the interaction between the apex predator and the human child. He had seen the footage like everyone else. But footage could be manipulated and stories could be invented. What he saw now was neither manipulation nor invention. What he saw was a bond that should not exist, formed in the crucible of desperation and survival, yet somehow more real than any political alliance he had ever witnessed. Yuna was brought before the council to testify about the rescue, her small form dwarfed by the vast chamber where the fate of civilizations was decided. She described how she had been cold and scared and alone, how the adults who protected her had stopped moving and would not wake up, how she had been certain she was going to die. Then she described the monster who had appeared in the doorway. "He was big," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of so many eyes upon her. "Bigger than anything I had ever seen, with claws and teeth and eyes that glowed in the dark." The council members nodded, their expectations confirmed by this description of worn savagery. "But he was gentle," Yuna continued, and the nodding stopped. "He picked me up so carefully, like I was made of glass, and he held me against his chest where it was warm." She described the journey through the storm, how Raxith had shielded her from the wind and the cold, how he had hummed to her when she was frightened, how he had covered her eyes so she would not see the bad things that happened when the ice forms attacked. "He could have left me," she said. "He could have escaped and been free, but instead he saved me and brought me back even though he knew they would put him in chains again." One of the council members, a being with too many limbs and cold calculating eyes, asked the question that everyone wanted answered. "Were you not afraid of him?" "Child." Yuna considered this with the seriousness that only children bring to important questions. "Monsters do not hum songs to scared children," she said finally. "Monsters do not cover your eyes so you will not see blood. And monsters do not kneel in the snow to protect you from people with guns." She looked directly at the council member who had asked, her small face set with determination beyond her years. "He is not a monster, and you should not kill him for saving me." The chamber was silent when she finished speaking, and Ambassador Park rose to make his formal request. "The human delegation invokes the right of species advocacy," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast room. "We will argue for the Vorn's right to exist." The council erupted into chaos, but Park stood calm at the center of the storm, and beside him, Yuna held her ground with the same stubborn courage that had helped her survive the frozen wastes of Kethvora. The transport ship lay broken across the ice like a wounded animal, its hull torn open by the impact and its engines Still smoking despite the freezing wind that howled around its corpse, Raxith approached slowly. Not from caution, but from a strange hesitation he did not understand. As if some part of him knew that what waited inside would change everything. The cold had numbed even his hardened scales by the time he reached the wreckage. And ice crystals had formed in the joints of his armor, plating where moisture from his breath had frozen solid. He tore through the damaged hull with claws that could rend starship metal, peeling back layers of destroyed machinery until he found the passenger compartment. The adult humans were dead, their bodies frozen in positions that spoke of desperate final moments spent trying to shield something precious from the crash. There were 4 of them, 2 male and 2 female, and they had arranged themselves in a circle around a small form huddled in the center of their protection, even in death. They had not abandoned their duty. Raxith stepped over their bodies with a respect he had never felt for any other species, recognizing in their sacrifice something that resonated with memories he had long buried. His people had once done the same, had thrown themselves between danger and their young with the same desperate courage. Before the council had burned that instinct out of them through generations of being hunted. The small form in the center of the dead adults stirred. Raxith froze, every predator instinct screaming at him to remain still, to not startle the prey. But this was not prey, and he was not hunting. A face emerged from the pile of thermal blankets the adults had wrapped around it. Small and soft and so fragile that Raxith felt something twist in his chest at the sight of it. Human. His mind supplied, one of the newer species to join galactic civilization. Known for their strange optimism and their unsettling habit of forming bonds with anything that moved, the child was female. Perhaps 6 cycles old by human reckoning, with dark hair matted to her pale face and eyes that were glassy with the beginning stages of hypothermia. She should have screamed. Every other species in the galaxy would have screamed at the sight of a Vorn filling the doorway. 8 feet of armored death with claws dripping ice and eyes that glowed with the bioluminescence of a deep space predator. The child did not scream. She looked up at Raxith with eyes that held no fear, only a desperate hope that made something ancient and forgotten stir in the deepest parts of his soul. And she spoke a single word: cold. Her voice was small, barely a whisper against the howling storm. But Raxith heard it as clearly as if she had shouted. He moved before thought could catch up with instinct, crossing the distance between them in a single stride and dropping to his knees beside her small form. Up close, she was even more fragile than he had realized. A tiny thing made of soft skin and delicate bones that would shatter under the slightest pressure from his claws. He should not touch her, should not risk damaging something so breakable. But the cold was killing her, and he could feel her life flickering like a flame in a wind that was determined to snuff it out. Raxith did something he had never done before. He gathered the child in his arms, careful beyond measure to keep his claws retracted and his strength restrained. And he pulled her against the core of his body where his natural heat ran hottest. The Vorn were endotherms of the highest order, their bodies capable of generating enough warmth to survive in the void of space for short periods. And that warmth now flowed into the freezing child like water filling an empty vessel. She should have struggled, should have fought against the monster holding her. But instead she burrowed deeper into his embrace with a trust that broke something inside him that he had not known was whole. Her small hands, blue with cold, gripped the ridges of his chest plates as if they were the only solid thing in a universe that had taken everything else from her. Raxith held her and did not know what to do next. The storm still raged outside, and the journey back to the prison would be long and brutal. But he could not stay here in this tomb surrounded by the dead who had given everything to protect this small life. He rose with the child cradled against his chest, and he began to walk. The return journey was harder than the outward trek. For now he had to shield the child from the wind with his own body while simultaneously fighting through drifts of snow that reached past his waist ice forms. The native predators of Kethvora sensed the heat of their bodies and rose from their burrows to investigate. Raxith killed the first one with a single swipe of his free arm, his claws opening its pale flesh from head to tail. But the child whimpered at the sound and buried her face against his scales. He killed the next 3 more quietly, snapping their necks with precise movements that made no sound the child might hear. And when the blood splattered across the snow, he angled his body so she would not see, and he did not understand why her distress caused him pain. He did not understand why her small fingers clutching his armor made him feel something other than the hollow emptiness that had defined his existence for so long. He only understood that he would die before he let anything harm her, and that understanding terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced. The child began to warm as they walked, her shivering slowly subsiding as his body heat drove back the killing cold. And somewhere in the howling white void she spoke again. "What are you?" Her voice was stronger now, curious rather than afraid. And Raxith found himself answering before he could consider the wisdom of speaking. "I am Vorn," he said, his voice a rumbling bass that vibrated through his chest and into her small body. "I am what your people call a monster." The child was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the serious consideration that only young humans seem capable of bringing to such conversations. "You do not feel like a monster," she said finally. "You feel warm." Raxith did not know how to respond to that, so he said nothing and simply continued walking. The child told him her name was Yuna, and that she had been traveling with her family to a new colony world when the storm had caught their ship. She did not ask about the adults in the wreckage, and Raxith did not tell her what he had seen. Some truths could wait until she was strong enough to bear them. She asked him why he had come for her, and he told her honestly that he did not know. She asked him if he was cold, and when he said no, she nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. She asked him to hum, because her mother always hummed to her when she was scared. And Raxith found himself making the low subsonic sound that Vorn mothers had once used to soothe their young. The sound seemed to comfort her, and she relaxed against him with a trust that he had done nothing to earn. The prison appeared through the storm like a dark monument to suffering, its walls rising from the ice like the bones of some ancient beast. And Raxith walked toward it knowing that he was returning to his death. The guards saw him coming and raised their weapons. Dozens of barrels trained on the monster emerging from the white void. But Raxith did not slow or turn aside. He walked until he stood before the main gate, the child still cradled against his chest. And then he did something that no Vorn had done in the presence of other species for generations. He knelt. The snow was cold beneath his knees as he lowered himself, but he did not notice the discomfort. He set Yuna down gently on the ground before him, making sure the thermal blanket still wrapped around her small body. And then he placed himself between her and the guns. If they fired, they would have to go through him to reach her. He waited, and the guards stared. And the storm howled around them all. Like a living thing, Yuna reached out and placed her small hand against his massive claw, her fingers tiny against his armored scales. And she spoke in a voice that somehow carried over the wind. "Please do not hurt my friend." The chains were made of starship-grade metal, forged in the heart of a dying sun and cooled in the void of space itself. Yet they groaned under the weight of the creature they held. Raxith sat in the center of his cell, 8 feet of armored scales and coiled muscle, his forearms locked behind his back by restraints that could anchor a battlecruiser. And still the guards refused to come within 20 meters of his cage. He was a Vorn, the last apex predator of a dying species, and every living thing in the prison feared him with a terror that bordered on worship. The cell around him was built from materials designed to contain explosive decompression, And even then, the warden had ordered 3 additional layers of reinforced plating welded to every surface after Raxith arrived. That had been 2 cycles ago. And in that time, not a single guard had entered his cell to deliver food or water. They simply opened a small hatch and pushed supplies through with a mechanical arm. As if feeding a beast in some ancient zoo, Raxith found their fear amusing in a hollow way that brought him no real joy. The prison of Kethvora was a frozen wasteland at the edge of known space. A place where the Galactic Council sent those too dangerous to execute publicly and too notorious to simply disappear murderers walked these halls. War criminals who had burned entire planets. Terrorists who had killed millions with engineered plagues. Yet all of them whispered about Raxith like frightened children telling stories around a fire. He had earned that fear honestly enough when the Galactic Enforcement Squad had come to his homeworld, with orders to capture him for crimes against civilized species. He had killed 14 of them with his bare claws before they finally brought him down with enough sedatives to drop a small moon. The trial had lasted less than an hour, a formality that everyone knew was simply a prelude to his execution. Tomorrow they would kill him, and the galaxy would breathe easier knowing that one more Vorn had been removed from existence. Raxith did not fear death, for he had been dying since the day the Council declared his entire species too dangerous to live. There were fewer than 100 Vorn left in all the galaxy, scattered and hunted, survivors of a genocide that the civilized races called pest control. His people had once numbered in the billions, had built cities that sang with subsonic harmonies, had raised their young in great communal dens, where the old taught the young the songs of their ancestors. All of that was gone now, burned away by Council warships that rained fire from orbit until nothing remained but ash and memory. Raxith was the last of his den, the final voice that remembered the songs his mother had hummed to him when he was small and soft, and the universe had not yet taught him to hate. He closed his eyes and let the cold of the cell seep into his scales, waiting for tomorrow with the patience of a predator who had long ago accepted that the hunt always ends the same way. The alarm shattered his meditation like a stone through. Glass red lights flooded the corridors outside his cell, and Raxith heard the distant thunder of boots as guards rushed towards some crisis he could not see. He opened his eyes and watched through the transparent wall of his cell as chaos erupted in the prison. A young guard ran past, his face pale with fear that had nothing to do with the monster in the cell, and Raxith caught fragments of shouted words that painted a picture of disaster. A transport ship had crashed in the frozen wastes outside the prison walls, brought down by the magnetic storms that made Kethvora such an effective cage. There were life signs in the wreckage, faint but present, and the temperature outside was dropping toward levels that would kill most species within minutes. Raxith listened as the warden's voice crackled over the communication system, declaring that no rescue team would be sent into the storm. The risk was too great, the warden said, and whatever poor souls had crashed in the wastes would simply have to die. It was not cruelty that drove the decision, merely the cold mathematics of survival that governed life on Kethvora. Raxith should not have cared, for he had no connection to whoever lay dying in the snow. No reason to feel anything but the same indifference that had carried him through years of hunting and being hunted. Yet something stirred in his chest when the guard mentioned that the life sign was small, too small to be an adult of any known species. A child, alone in the frozen dark, waiting for a rescue that would never come. He rose to his feet before he understood why, his chains groaning in protest as muscles built for killing strained against their bonds. The earthquake 3 days ago had damaged the eastern wall of his cell, creating a hairline fracture that the guards had not yet repaired because none of them would enter his space. Raxith had noticed the weakness immediately, had studied it with the patient attention of a predator evaluating an escape route. But he had not acted because there was nowhere to escape to. Now he looked at that crack with different eyes. The chains that held his arms were strong, but they were anchored to a floor that was slightly weaker where the fracture ran beneath the metal plating Raxith pulled. And for a long moment, nothing happened except the sound of stressed metal screaming in protest. Then the floor buckled. The anchors tore free, and he was loose. He did not head for the exit that would lead deeper into the prison. Did not try to fight his way of freedom or revenge himself upon the guards who had kept him caged. Instead, he went to the damaged wall and began to dig his claws. Designed by evolution to tear through armor plating and reinforced bone, made short work of the weakened structure. Cold air rushed in as he broke through to the outside, and even his adapted physiology recoiled from the brutal temperature that waited beyond. The storm was a living thing, a howling beast of ice and wind that would kill lesser creatures in heartbeats. But Raxith was not a lesser creature. He was a Vorn, born on a world where the very air could freeze blood in veins. And he had survived worse than this. Behind him, he heard shouts of alarm as the guards realized what was happening. But none of them tried to stop him. They simply watched in stunned confusion as the galaxy's most dangerous predator walked out into a storm that promised death, heading not toward escape, but toward a crashed ship, where a single small life sign flickered. Like a candle in the dark, Raxith did not understand why he was doing this. He did not know what force drove him forward through wind that cut like knives and cold that seeped through even his armored scales. He only knew that somewhere in the frozen waste ahead, something small and helpless was waiting, and for reasons he could not name. He refused to let it die alone. The storm swallowed him whole, and the guards watched until even his massive form disappeared into the white void. None of them expected to see him again. None of them could have predicted what he would bring back with him.